blink, and a one, and a two, and a he, ha, hoof, ha, da, da, beep, bop, beep, boop, boo. Rada, beep, bop, 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 bop. Ba-da, ba, 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 ba. I don't know. I went to bed last night at my normal time, about 5:45 p.m. And then I woke up my usual time at 6:15 p.m. and I've just been running on empty all day. I don't know what's with me, but I am taking this week off because I got my son here with me. He's in the other room having entirely too long hair. But I didn't want to miss New Comic Day, obviously. So I hauled him up to the shop with me and put him to work, and he was really not very good at it. But for his first day, he was fine. But yeah, I am really looking forward to sleeping in the next few days and getting some reading in because I only have gotten. I'll get into that. All right, first up this week, I bought Above Snakes #1. This is by Sean Lewis and Hayden Sherman, which are two names that I'm not familiar with, but that doesn't necessarily mean anything. I saw that there were house ads for this in other Image books the last few weeks, and it looked interesting because it's at least somewhat of a Western. I think it's more of like a fantasy Western, but that's fine by me. Any kind of weird Western is A-okay. Warren, my boss, who doesn't read a lot of new comics, he'll usually manage to read one or two of the new releases just to be able to talk about them. He said it was really good. He said it was very Neil Gaiman like, and he doesn't even like Neil Gaiman, so I figure that's probably a safe bet. I wasn't going to get it because I just keep getting more and more comics. I really need to start cutting down at least a little bit, but not today, Jesus. Also today came out Avengers, X-Men, and Eternals: Eve of Judgment. So AXE is going to be Marvel's big summer crossover, and even even as a diehard Marvel zombie, I'm like, okay. The Eternals is an odd property in that Jack Kirby created them in the late '70s, possibly the mid '70s. Yeah, I think that's probably closer to it. And this was after he had come back to Marvel. So he had started at Marvel, or he helped found Marvel Comics as we know it today in the early '60s, and he stayed with them until the early '70s, until he was tired of being treated poorly. So he went over to DC, where they would also treat him poorly. And so after a few years there, where he didn't get to do, and because DC was like, you can do whatever you want. We will do anything to have Jack Kirby at DC, and so that was where he created his whole Fourth World series, and Dark Side and Apocalypse. Those are all Jack Kirby creations. But it didn't work out too good, so he went back to Marvel, and it was a big deal. And one of the conditions of coming back to Marvel was that he'd be allowed to do the Eternals, which was very, very similar to his Fourth World New Gods type of thing. And this was definitely, I mean, Jack had always been very cosmically minded, like the Silver Surfer was his, well, it's his and Stan's, but, and all that FF stuff, he was always very big into that sort of thing, that kind of mythology. And that was, I mean, that's, to me, is one of the reasons why Jack Kirby is held in such high reverence by dorks like me, because he saw superhero comics as a mythology, almost a religion. And I mean, he was a nice Jewish boy, don't get me wrong, but he definitely, that was the sort of thing he was interested in. Like, he would make this motion, the big cosmic stuff. So when he came back to Marvel, I don't know how set in stone this was, but he really wanted the Eternals to not be part of the Marvel universe, which was, nobody else would be able to get away with that. Jack Kirby was the only one who could ask for something like that and mostly get it. I think by the end of the original I want to say it was 18 issues in an annual, but by the end of that year and a half, he had written some of the other Marvel characters into it. Because that's another thing. This is something that I actually have only really kind of gotten my head wrapped around. Is that Marvel was the world building company. DC didn't really start doing that until Marvel did it. They would have books like World's Finest and Justice League because putting their most profitable characters together led to more sales, but they weren't interested in a shared universe, and stories would often contradict each other in the DC universe in the same title. Nobody cared because they were just like, it's just for kids anyway. So when Kirby came back and he said, I don't want the Eternals to be a part of the Marvel universe, and Marvel said okay, at first at least, it was because it was weird. It was weird. It was unheard of. At that point, Marvel had only been about world building since 1961, and then obviously, well, I don't know how obvious it is. Eventually, Jack left Marvel again for the final time, and I think the Eternals kind of just went. The Eternals have had their own series several times since Kirby's time, but I want to say not until the 90s, maybe. And even like Neil Gaiman, speaking of which, did do an Eternal series in the early 2000s, and they would do like mini series and stuff like that. And I'd always read them because they were Marvel comics, but they were still very separate. Even like Cersei was part of the Avengers for a while, and stuff like that. But the Eternals always felt separate from the Marvel universe. So fast forward to today, where the entire Marvel universe is being mined for film properties. Now, I don't have any real problem with that, but it is starting to get up my nose a tiny bit, I think, because this is what it turns into. There was for the first real egregious example of this was back in 2013, 2014, when the MCU was, still pretty new, but it definitely been established as this is going to be our cash printing machine for the next who knows how many years. And Marvel still did not have the rights to the X-Men. So what they thought they would do is basically kill off the X-Men in the comics and replace them with the Inhumans, which they did own. And it didn't work. It was not a very good story. That was during the Infinity storyline, which I didn't like, even though it was Jonathan Hickman. And it was around that time that in that story, so the Inhumans activate their superpowers by walking through the Terrigen mists, which are these mystical chemical, you know, hot springs basically on the moon that they have, and that mist activates their powers. And in the Infinity storyline, the Black Bolt, the King of the Inhumans, drops a Terrigen bomb, and it sweeps the Earth. And so anybody who has any Inhuman DNA in them all of a sudden finds themselves with superpowers. Ms. Marvel, the star of the new television program that people are losing their minds for, that's how she got her powers. And it wasn't, I mean, it was a big swing, and that was also, yeah, the decimation with the X books had already taken place a few years previous. So a lot of the mutants had been kind of wiped out already anyway. But it didn't work. They tried to. There was like two or three Inhumans titles. Again, which I read because I like the Inhumans, not as a replacement for the X-Men, but I was like, well, I'll read these Inhumans books. But it just didn't take because nobody in the comics gave a shit. And then that was around the time that they started developing the ill-fated Inhumans television program, which no one watched. I'm the only person I know who's ever watched any of it. And I only watched the pilot. And I mostly only watched it because they were playing it at the Burbank AMC, and I wanted to get out of the summer heat for an hour and a half. Wasn't very good. I enjoyed it, but it wasn't very good. And then eventually they bought Fox anyway, so it became a moot point. So now the Inhumans are back to being, background players. But then they're like, well, what other team movies can we come up with? Avengers is big, always big for us, and the X-Men movies are still very big. Like they wanted another team movie, and the Eternals was the next one they went to. And I didn't hate the movie. I didn't like it particularly, but I thought it was fine. But It's just I've not really. They're trying to push the Eternals to try to sell the movie instead of the other way around. You know, it would have been cooler if they'd done this Eternals movie and then been, this to me feels like this big crossover is, and this is just, I think this is like basically the alpha issue. The main crossover would be called AXE, Avengers X Men Eternals. And I haven't read a bunch about it because I don't want any spoilers, but I think it's basically that in the current continuity, mutants have figured out a way to reincarnate so that they don't die now, and that was a well kept state secret in Krakoa, but it has since gone public. Um, so now everyone knows that the mutants can live forever if they so choose. I mean, there's some stipulations, and I think in this case the Eternals are like, well, we can't let that sit still because we're the Eternals around here. And then I believe the Avengers kind of get caught in the middle because they share teammates. Like I said, Cersei was an Avenger. She might have been the only Eternal who was an Avenger. Now I'm thinking about it. No, Gilgamesh also was an Avenger. I do think that's it though. And then Wolverine was an Avenger. In fact, there was an uncanny Avengers team where a bunch of X Men joined the Avengers. So the Avengers are kind of caught in the middle. And it's by Kieran Gillen, who I really enjoy, and even his current run on the Eternals, although it's very clearly dictated by the film, still pretty enjoyable. I'm, you know, I always look forward to whatever big crossover Marvel does every year, but it's not. There's some years where I'm like, okay, is that? I guess that was all you could come up with. Huh? I really think they missed because Devil's Reign, which just ended, was really good, and I don't see why that couldn't have been a bigger crossover or a Reckoning War for that matter, which is far more. I feel the moon blew up in that story. Nobody's talking about it in the Marvel universe. I guess they thought it was a Mr. Show sketch, but yeah. So I want to get to this to see if it'll be as middling as I unfortunately think it will be. But hopefully, I hope I'm wrong. I hope I'm proved incorrect. This is the biggest thing I'm looking forward to for a while. This is Barbaric: The Harvest Blades #1. This was my pick for the shop this week. Barbaric, if you'll recall, was a 3-issue series which will be coming back to another monthly, I believe, wherein a barbarian has been cursed to only do good. He can't do anything wrong, even though he very much wants to. And he has an axe that talks to him and will tell him which people to kill and which not. And the axe itself gets drunk on blood. It's super fun. It's super violent. It's right up my alley. So there was only 3 issues, and I think it blew up more than they thought it was going to, especially because it's Vault, which is a pretty small indie publisher. But it's super good. The art's really good. The story's super fun. So I think they were kind of not scrambling necessarily, but since the reaction, I mean, the first issue went into at least 4 printings, so I think they were kind of caught with their pants down a little bit. They didn't expect it to be quite the hit that it was. Um, and so I feel like this one shot is meant to tide us over until they can do another monthly book, and hopefully that monthly book will be more than 3 issues. I would love it if it was just an indefinite monthly book like they used to have, but chances are it'll probably just be a bunch of 6-issue series. But boy, I can't wait for that. I've been pushing this on people a lot lately too, and I'm not. I think the characters that I mentioned are not on the cover that I can see anyway. Now, that might be one of them, but I believe this gal, whose name I can't remember, is like the one who kind of teams up with this barbarian character. So I think maybe we'll just be finding out more about her. In fact, I should just pull out those barbarics and read them again. It's only 3 issues, but yeah, those are pretty good picks of the week. And now picks of the do So yeah, I have gotten at least got these read. I've gotten a few more books read, but oh boy, I cannot wait until tomorrow. That's not a sentence you hear me say very often. This I read Absolution #1. This was super fun. This was not what I expected, and I'm glad of it. So in the future, it's a very death sports type of thing, and that's kind of a subgenre that I've always liked. Death Race 2000, Rollerball, others that weren't made in the 70s. Those are some of my favorite stories. Is the bread and circuses, and it's not. I mean, the satirical aspect of it. Oh, Americans like violent sports. Um, taken to its most ridiculous conclusion. I understand the social commentary side of it, but honestly, I just like violent media. And but in this one, so what happens is, yeah, if you're convicted of crime, murder, or what have you, you can absolve yourself, and they put a bunch of cameras and stuff in you, so people can watch you absolve yourself by killing other bad guys or getting killed yourself. So it becomes like a game show, and yeah, it's really cool. The main character is obviously struggling with this, but yeah, it's great fun, and it's Peter Milligan and Mike Deodato Jr. And they both do a little write up, and like I mentioned, the little write ups that they do in the back of these books are usually pretty skippable. But Deodato's in particular was really cool because he talked about how back 25 years ago he was drawn a book about a female assassin trying to absolve herself of her past, and that was at Marvel. And then he worked for Marvel for a long time, and then he said, "I'm going to go over to AWA where I'll own all my stuff." And now he's much older now. I think he's pushing 60, and he said, "Now I'm drawing another book about a female assassin who's trying to absolve herself of her past." The first one was Elektra, which was also written by Peter Milligan, which I'd forgotten about. So I was, that's pretty neat, and full circle there. And it's always nice to hear guys like Deodato talk about their careers in such a way that they're not bitter. You know what I mean? Like working in comics, and this is from, you know, I'm an invested fan of this sort of thing, but I'm still kind of an outsider. But even where I'm sitting, it's a terrible industry. It really treats the creative element very poorly indeed. And it's almost inevitable. It's really, I was talking to a guy today, in fact, and he was saying that somebody else was kind of giving him advice and was like, well, you're always going to get fucked. It's just a matter of trying to get fucked less every time. And it's really depressing that that's the case, but it kind of is. But there are happy endings still, and I don't mean to just jerk off with this. Especially as time marches on, like there's always been an independent comic book industry. It's just always been very small and very grassroots, and it's grown and grown and grown. And a lot of the bad parts of the industry are pretty systemic. Like it's just kind of work for hire has just always been how it's done, and no one in a position of power to change that is at all interested in doing so. But once Image Comics became a thing in the 30 years ago, and they've really brought that industry standard up much higher, a lot of people would still rather go to Marvel or DC because they're the big boys. But Image has really become the third publisher. It's the Fox network of comics, and that's enheartening. And I mean, even to today, there's way more independent comic book publishers that have been in years. In the 80s and 90s, there were a ton. And then once the bubble broke in like the mid to late 90s, they all went under pretty much to a man. So now, and then 20 years hence, the industry has been climbing back, to get back. And I've always felt like the output of the comic book industry of all the publishers has only gotten better over the years. So I completely lost my point. What a surprise. Good comic is what I'm saying. I also this was super fun. Mind Management bootleg. I was really bummed though to find out that I was the only person at my comic book store to buy this. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of our regulars tend to favor a lot of the indie stuff. I mean, there's obviously all the superhero diehards, but then there's also I also buy a lot of indie stuff. This one nobody gives a poop, I guess. I don't know, but it was really good, and Farrell Dalrymple's only gotten better as an artist, and it's exactly what it was. It was enough to remind me of what because it's been years since Mind Management now, but it was enough to remind like, oh right, yeah, I remember this stuff. But it's a new character, it's a whole new story. It calls back to the first series, but you don't really have to have read it. And yeah, it's super fun spy stuff like I was talking about last week. Yeah, it's I don't really have much else to add to it. Dalrymple is great. Kent is great. It's a great book. You should read it. There's something wrong with Patrick Todd number one. This was super fun. I am super stoked on this. Ed Brisson I've been a fan of for a while, but he's up there with like Zeb Wells and Kelly Thompson, Rainbow Rowell, writers like that who started out on books that I liked, and then I grew to like them more than the book even. So like like Zeb Wells had been around for years, and I'd read books that he had written and enjoyed them, but never enough to really like go out of my way for his work. But I do now, and Brisson's been like that for a while. In fact, he's writing the new Predator comic coming from Marvel pretty soon. I'm super excited about that. But I have a cute little story to tell. So I was reading this funny book here. Patrick Todd is a telepath. Um, there's a more specific word that I'm reaching for here, but he can essentially control people. He can tell them what to do when they do it. And he also has a sick mother, so he tells people to rob banks for him, and he purposefully will find criminals, guys who already should be in jail, get them to rob a bank for him. They bring him the money, and then he has them turn themselves in. And then when they get to the police station, they're like, I have no idea why I'm here. I know what happened. I know what I did, but I didn't do it on purpose. So it's a really, really great premise. But as I was reading it within the first couple of pages, there's a caption that says it takes place in Canada in 2010. And so, and then get to the end of the book, and there's a this is something you see a lot nowadays too, which I also think is cool. It's very Watchmen-y, where there'll be some back matter, but it'll just be like some text usually, but something that pertains to the story. So the back of this issue, there's a couple arrest reports on some of these other guys that Patrick Todd has coerced into robbing a bank for him, and then also the medical report on his mother's illness. But I was reading that, and those were all dated in 2020 and 2021. So I was like, well, that's 10 years. I'm like, this is so I. But I was already so into the book that I looked up Ed Brisson online. And I found his email address, and I wrote to him and I said, hey, I really really like the book. I said I don't know if I'm reading this wrong, but it said 2010, but then it was in 2021. So I was like, is that a discrepancy, or am I spoiling something? Or is that going to be explained later? And he wrote back right away. He went, oh no, that was a mistake. You caught a mistake. And I went, oh, okay, well, shit. I said, I wasn't angling for a no prize. I just want you to know that. I was just asking for a clarification. I wasn't trying to be like, you made a mistake. And he said, no, I didn't take it that way. A no prize, if you're unfamiliar. Back in the glorious bullpen days of Marvel Comics, the 60s, if a reader found a goof in a comic book, right, an anachronism, or just some sort of continuity error, they would write in, and if they wrote in with an explanation, so say like in one panel, you know, the Human Torch is completely engulfed in flames, but in the very next panel, his hand is not, and then a reader might write in and go, "Oh well, he wanted a drink of water in between panels or something like that," and then you would get a no prize. Stan would send you a no prize, which the joke initially was that they would send you nothing, hence the name. It was just a blank. It was an empty envelope, I think. And then I think eventually they would send you an envelope that if you it had nothing in it, but if you unfolded the envelope, it would there would be a no prize on the paper. And then it just kind of became shorthand for anybody writing in to any comic to point out a mistake. So that was what I said. I wasn't gunning for a no prize, but he said, I'm going to send you one anyway. So he's sending me a signed copy of this. So I'll be sure to show that off. But that's the first time I've gotten a no prize. I'm very careful. Like, I try to be on this stupid thing, be very careful not to be critical. And even if I have some criticism, I want to be as constructive as possible. So I was very careful when I wrote it. I was pretty sure it was a mistake. I thought it was just like a typo or something. But Brisson was like, "Oh yeah, I'm glad you said something. I can fix it for the trade." And I was like, "I helped." Yeah, it feels good. I love comics, and I want them to be good. And as a writer myself, if the situation was reversed, I too would be grateful. I'd be embarrassed personally, but I'd be like, thank God somebody caught it at this point. So, because that's the other thing, fixing it for the trade, many more people are going to see that trade paperback than are going to read this first issue, as a single issue. So, you're welcome, Ed Brisson. I hope it's Brisson and not Brisson. I've been saying it wrong all this time. Okay, that's it. I am exhausted, so I'm going to go have a cup of coffee. I get to sleep in tomorrow.